So my name is Evan Turner. I represent AMP Energy, who is has a lease option for property with WD Cowls for 5 prospective sites around Shutesbury, mostly on the west and southwest parts of town. We will cover the specific sites in a moment. I work with AMP as a developer, taking solar projects exclusively from a raw piece of land into a functional operating built solar array. We started up several years ago looking at some land in Shutesbury owned by WD Cowls, and it has matured over the last 2 years to where we are today. AMP, aside from me, I am a very local developer. AMP is a global owner, operator, and developer of renewable assets at many scales and at many different countries, with a big focus in North America because they are originally Canadian and still Canadian. They didn't change, but they've done stuff all over the globe, from Japan to India to plenty of work in Canada. And they've gotten real invested and interested in this Northeast Massachusetts market. And they've been my partner with development work for the better part of 3+ years now. So I do and focus on a lot of local work. They provide me the resources of a big company who will own and operate this stuff and can make very serious commitments. And as Michael mentioned earlier in the meeting, a lot of this discussion, I think, may circle around the bylaws. The short version is your bylaws have a number of features that are very challenging to permit through that are de facto prohibition. And we don't want to find ourselves, if we can avoid it, in a case where we'll have to submit an application. We just get turned down because they're de facto not possible to work at all. And then we end up in a litigious route that I don't really think benefits anyone in that circumstance, especially in light of the state rulings and the Dover Amendment on what is permissible, what is not. I will tell you personally, I think there are a number of things in your bylaw that would not stand up during an appeal process, but I don't want to go crack the bylaw just to do it. I want to find a way that makes this work much better with Shutesbury and meets the spirit and intent of your bylaw. But it may not meet it in the exact form and function you envisioned. One of these challenges, by example, and I don't think this is intentional, but you get into the weeds of it and it happens, large scale arrays are not allowed in the yellow. It is a zoning quirk / case in Massachusetts from case law that access is the use. So in this case, not allowing the yellow to serve as access road for a solar array means I couldn't permit an access road anywhere on one of these major streets to any of the arrays. That's a pretty frustrating situation to be in. That is quasi de facto prohibition. So there are some things like that I think your bylaw could do honestly better with the full light of, knowing you're not supposed to prohibit it, but reasonably regulate it. This is more of a quirk, but it does, sort of highlight a big issue that if I'm going into a development cycle this year with 5 projects, I don't want something like this hanging out there that is a pretty painful, appeal or process down the line. So other items that we'd love to discuss, the access road limitations that Mr. Jeff Lacey brought up in our previous planning board icebreaker meeting, another easy thing we think we could handle. But then there are some things that are really challenging. The mitigation for carbon sequestration, we obviously want to do it. We are very well versed in the carbon math. And I think, the spirit of the Walter C. Jones Working Forest is, very much meets that and does above and beyond. There are some habitat impacts that I think we are undervaluing a little bit, the value of the pollinators, as well as the fact that it's just private property, which it is difficult to say what the owner should do through a zoning bylaw so far as what they're obligated to do with trees or not trees, a use, no use, a different use. And then the solar map is not terribly challenging, but it may be a little weird for that 3rd array south of the original array. But that's otherwise, I don't want to run into a conflict there. That one might be reasonable to work with. But some other items, for instance, like your layers of the biomap.
I first have a question for Donna about the bylaw, the solar bylaw that was passed. So the solar bylaw was passed and then approved by the Attorney General.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
And there was some notations in that, or some qualifications in that approval, just saying these are things you might want to pay attention to, but it did not disapprove of our bylaw.
Right.
So I guess, Evan, when you talk about litigating the bylaw, I'm just really curious if this is something that has, why do you think you'll be able to litigate if in fact the bylaw has been approved by the AG's office and was approved by town meeting?
Mm-hmm. So I'll go with Tom Reidy after I answer this. If Tom, you want to load up some thoughts. The AG approving a bylaw is not the same thing as saying the bylaw is in concurrence with the Dover Amendment at the state level. My understanding is their approvals are largely limited to blatantly incorrect illegal structures that would be like basically discrimination. We shall not permanent array to someone over the age of 73. Some obvious category that's wrong. It is not interpreting what reasonable regulation would be in Chapter 40, Section 3A. So there are some cases where that has gone to court. And I think the guidance you would get from the AG is be very careful that you don't implement a bylaw as to be de facto prohibition, because that would be a very challenging place for you to be.
Yeah, and maybe just to follow up on that, as Attorney McNichol can probably tell you, the letters that you get from the Attorney General's office when they're approving solar bylaws come with, what I'll call a big asterisk saying, superficially okay, but watch how it's actually conditioned or enforced, because that's where you can run into the problems, as Evan mentioned, with 40A Section 3, the so-called Dover Amendment. And I think one of the best examples that Evan had mentioned was when you look for strict application of your zoning bylaw and the fact that, as he mentioned, access is use, and that you can't actually access any of the backland without going through a prohibited zone. So effectively, you can't reach that zone. If the Attorney General's office had all of those details, they probably would have called that out, but they just don't look that far. They look, as Evan mentioned, superficially to say there's nothing on the surface or on the face of it discriminatory, and it doesn't offend 48 Section 3 or other state law. And so it's when it's applied that there could be issues.
So I guess my follow-up question is back to you, Donna. You reviewed this, worked with the planning board on the bylaw. What's your take on how strong it is, or do you anticipate?
I don't think it's quite as black and white as Mr. Turner or Attorney Reidy are saying. They're absolutely correct. The Attorney General looks at the bylaw to make sure that it isn't obviously illegal. They do consider the Dover Amendment because it's a very important part of Massachusetts state law. The Dover Amendment is essentially the amendment that says you can't unreasonably regulate education, farmland, et cetera, et cetera. And you're all familiar with it, even though you may not be familiar with it being called the Dover Amendment. And certainly the Dover Amendment is applicable to unreasonable regulation of solar. But there's case law that's very clear that some pretty strict solar bylaws have been held to be constitutional, and even though they were challenged by solar companies, the court said sorry. For instance, the example that you can't get through the 500 feet of rural residential to the backland. Well, we know that you may not be able to through rural residential, but you can through the TC district. And there's a footnote right in the zoning bylaw that says that if you're going through the TC district, the use, even if the use is prohibited in the TC, if it's allowed in the FC, you can get through. The other thing is you could always put a subdivision road in. You could put a very simple subdivision road through the RR and get to the backland. And subdivision roads are not considered a use in the same way that Mr. Turner explained a driveway to a solar facility would be. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, our bylaw is very strict. And everybody knows that. But to categorize it as something that would be struck down in court, you'd still have to apply for the permit, you'd still have to be turned down, then you'd have to appeal it. It's just not that black and white. That doesn't mean that the town doesn't want to work with AMP. It doesn't mean any of those things. But I think that we don't have to be as concerned about the bylaw or the challenges.